or close behind you. If there's to limit noise, please, if you come in and out, just try to be as quiet as you can. And masks are optional once you're sitting down, so that is a personal choice. Moving on to the session now, the way it's going to be structured is we have our GWEC Nairobi-based colleagues, Wangari Muchiri and Jerome Neeson, who are going to tell you all about our new Africa Focus Initiative, Africa Wind Power, which we've just launched only a month ago. And they're going to provide some opening remarks, and then we're going to move on to a panel discussion and we'll introduce our panelists following that presentation. So on that note, I will pass it over to you, Wangari and Jerome. Please take it away and set the scene for us as to how wind energy is doing in Africa.
Great, thank you so much, Emerson, and hello everybody. Lovely to be here and join you virtually from Nairobi. My name is Wangari Muchiri. I'm a renewable energy engineer and also the coordinator of Africa Wind Power. I work closely with Emerson and Jerome, who you'll meet shortly. So Africa Wind Power is GWEC's new initiative to increase the development and deployment of wind power across the continent. And one of the things that we just love to share some of the facts around the vast potential of wind power across Africa. We have 59,000 gigawatts potential, both onshore and offshore. And we've only currently installed about 7 gigawatts on the continent. So that's about 0.01%, and it shows you how far we have to go. It's really a long journey. So GWEC recently launched Africa Wind Power to establish a regional body that helps facilitate discussions between public sector and private sector stakeholders in order for them to be able to understand more about wind power and also be able to tap into it, to include it into their energy mixes, and also just to know more about wind power. The African continent is one of the most impacted by climate change, and it's one of the ones that we feel like the transition in energy, so the clean energy transition is very important, both at an African level and a global level. And so we think wind power is going to be a key solution to this. In addition to that, wind power can support the creation of meaningful jobs. It can reduce the cost of electricity on the continent. One of the things that I've seen so far in South Africa, which is one of the more developed wind energy markets, is that it's already created in its nascent stage 18,000 jobs. So we can only imagine what that will look like across the continent once wind power has taken up more. In addition, wind power is also not embraced as much as we would like it across the continent. We see a lot more solar and hydro projects on the ground, and the complementarity between solar and hydro and wind is something that is really great. So also just being able to share some of those so that we can have a more robust energy mix across the continent is also really important. With a lot of also new innovative solutions coming in every day, we're seeing the advent of green hydrogen, the developments in offshore wind. I really think Africa has a key, or is able to leapfrog these traditional energy systems. So using wind power as one of the ways that they can do that, I think, is something that really should be at the forefront of all our minds. In addition to that, Africa Wind Power really wanted to address the dialogue between the stakeholders on the ground. I think before GWEC was doing it really ad hoc, on an ad hoc basis. There was not a really formalized way to do it at the moment. So what they're doing now is using Africa Wind Power as the interface between government stakeholders, the Africa wind industry, just to ensure that we have clean, affordable, renewable energy generation from wind, and that coming to the forefront of especially policy making and the likes. We also like to emphasize that we are based in Kenya. So Jerome and I are the team based here in Kenya, and we're supported by Get Invest, which is the European program that aims to really decentralize, to increase mobilization and or increase investment in the renewable energy sector across Africa. And so the good thing about being based on the continent is that it allows us to really draw expertise and knowledge from the global industry, which GWEC gives us access to, but also gives us the on-the-ground experience that you'll hear a bit more about. We have some of our partners like Juliana from ESSAC on the ground. So really great to be here. Really hope that Africa Wind Power will help in increasing the development and deployment of wind power throughout the continent. And would like to welcome you that if you're interested to work with us, please drop a comment in the chat. please also let Emerson know in person in Glasgow. We would really like to follow up with that. And we also welcome you to join to check out our website, africawindpower.com. So if there's anything else that you'd like to learn more about Africa Wind Power, work with us, or know more about us, we're happy to work with you. I will now hand over to my colleague, Jerome. Jerome, over to you. Thank you.
Are you there, Jerome? I think he's frozen. I think we're gonna have to move on. Sorry, Wangari, we think Jerome is frozen. So unfortunately, unless he comes back this very second, we're gonna kick off the panel.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, thank you so much, Wangari. That was great. Great rundown on Africa Wind Power, and we hope to have you here at COP next time around. Hopefully, maybe next year in Egypt.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
All the best. So moving on to our panelists. I think we could start by doing a bit of a tour de table with a brief introductions. We have representatives from private sector, from finance, and from South Africa, and the wider business community, and how sustainable development is, and wind has played a key role there. So perhaps we can start with you, John, and just to go around with you coming at the end, Juliana, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Emerson, and good morning to all of you. My name is John Lezamith. I'm Global Head of Public Affairs at Siemens Gamesa, and currently chairing the Africa Task Force as at GWEC, which was established back in March 2017. So thank you very much for coming.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Vivek Pathak. I'm the Global Head of Climate Finance, Climate Business at the IFC, and we're very excited about the fact that GWEC is now keen in Africa. That's a continent that we feel has potential, and we hope we can scale up there soon. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, both here and online. My name is Joanne Yarwich. I'm from the National Business Initiative in South Africa. I'm its chief executive. I'm also a commissioner on the Presidential Climate Commission, and thank you very much for the invitation.
Juliana, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Emerson. Hello, everyone. My name is Juliana Kainga. I am the Vice Chairperson of the Electricity Sector Association of Kenya, ESAC, which is a private sector body that represents players in the electricity space and seeks to ensure that the sector remains sustainable for the long term. I also work for Enel Green Power in its business development arm based in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you, everyone. So, I think we could start with the general question here, and I think there's agreement in the room. We've had thematic sessions around different geographies and how wind energy is being developed in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, and there's consensus that we need more of a public-private partnership. So and wind is seen as a key climate solution. After all, we're here at COP26, but I think the angle is a bit different when it comes to Africa. We know that emissions, as far as emissions contributions, Africa is really not anywhere near the top. Perhaps some of the from some of the emissions coming out of South Africa's coal fleet, perhaps as the only example. So when we talk about wind energy, it's really about the socioeconomic benefits. So I think that given that Africa is, victim to the worst effects of climate change, I'd like to ask, each panelist, how can the private sector spur African policymakers to really achieve greater uptake in renewables, including wind energy beyond the business as usual case? So, John, over to you.
Well, I think, Emerson, our company, specifically Siemens Gamesa, we have been in Africa since 1990s. We were one of the pioneers in developing the wind sector, and we have seen a huge progress in the investment appetite in renewables and in wind in particular in the continent. Please, just to have an overview, Africa, as you may know, is a 1,200 million people continent, and there are only 5 gigas of wind power installed. And if we compare it, for example, with my home country, with Spain, 47 million people living in the country with 26 gigas of wind power installed. It is said recently also that the energy demand in Africa is going to triple by 2040. So with the competitiveness of wind power currently, and with the socio-economic benefits arising from wind power, operational maintenance people, engagement with universities, technical people being trained, civil works. I mean, there are box amount of different elements with a multiplying effect in unlocking the full potential of wind power in Africa. We were talking about that, Emerson, previously. I mean, a recent report by IFC together with Everus and GQuake, on top of, I said, the 5 gigas of wind power installed currently, this report states that Africa has a potential of 59,000 gigas of wind power commercially viable. So there is the energy needs. Africa is endowed with vast renewable sources, wind in particular. The investment appetite from the private sector is huge. We are not newcomers. We have been in the continent since 1990s, as said. So we want to bring and engage with public stakeholders to try to enable the appropriate frameworks in the continent to let us invest. This is not about the way it was financed at the very beginning only, with development banks being involved with public utilities. There are countries already like South Africa, Kenya, fostering IPP sector, Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia. So everything, the equation is perfect. We only have to push and get it launched.
Thanks, John. I mean, that's really a big point about the vast potential there that's ready to be tapped into. Juliana, if we can go over to you, I mean, you know, you work for a developer, obviously, but you also represent the Electricity Sector Association of Kenya. So you're in a great position to tell us, you know, how the private sector and a private sector body like yours can really push policymakers to grab this potential. How are you seeing it? How are you doing it?
Thanks, Emerson. I think what has been said so far is very apt and very right. But from an ESAC standpoint, because our role is definitely to collaborate and engage with policymakers. And the discussion that we've seen, if you really want to move away from the business as usual discussion, and historically that has been promoting renewable energy on the supply side, which is generation of electricity for consumption in our homes, and also as an input to production for industries and manufacturing. That we have focused on it, and I think we've gotten that right. It does have its challenges, and we still need to work on it. But what we are hearing from public sector ministries and policymakers is how are we actually going to contribute to the economic growth of the country? Can renewable energy do this? So what we're seeing is the conversation is shifting from the supply side into the demand side of the discussion. And renewable energy is really well positioned to actually play on both sides very well. So these are some of the conversations that are happening. They've started. There are some studies and some ways they're trying to quantify these opportunities in order for players and private sector stakeholders to actually take part in this. And if we're saying that Africa is the future and the future is green, and we're seeing sectors like in transportation and automotives looking to have majority of their sales by 2030, have them as EV electric vehicles, then surely Africa should be part of that transition. And we're really well placed to actually provide those inputs there. So mine is to ensure that we're not just selling wind alone. We also have to give that input of how renewable energy is contributing to economic growth and how it's contributing to the demand side of the equation. Thanks,
Juliana. And Vivek, I mean, the IFC is the private sector financing arm of the World Bank. We know Africa is a big focus for you. From your perspective, how can we capitalize on Africa's wind potential?
So I think first and foremost, we collectively need to get the message across to governments and stakeholders that there is wind potential in Africa. And I think different numbers have been thrown out. The number my team gave me is 180,000 terawatts per year. I don't know if that's accurate or not, but I'll use it there.
It is.
And the demand, which is that's about 250 times what the continent needs. So that's one point. The second point is wind speeds in a lot of these locations is over 8.5 meters per second. So clearly Africa has the potential, but there seems to be a misperception that it's expensive and the potential is not there. So I think what we need to collectively do is I don't want to use the term educate because that's patronizing, but at least socialize the fact that there is potential for wind. And if done correctly, it can be economical. So that's one point. Now, how do we get there? I can elaborate similar to what we've done in scaling solar. It's about having the right policies in place. It's about having governments have fair PPAs where the risk reward is fair. It's about getting some amount of blended finance for people like us, because these things take time to develop. And I just want to say that financing has never been a constraint for a well-structured infrastructure project anywhere in the world. So I don't think financing will be a constraint. And we saw this happen when we rolled out scaling solar. We had large European firms coming in to bid. We had bankers and financiers from all over the world who were willing to finance it. So it's really a matter of getting the message out there in a sustained manner, getting people to understand the potential, working with governments and other stakeholders to have the right policies in place, and the private capital will flow, in my view. So it's going to be a combination of factors. And lastly, what I want to say is that the huge potential that exists in Africa today is on the manufacturing side. We don't talk about it. But if you look at the natural resources Africa has, a lot of those are exported, processed somewhere else, and then they get re-exported. Now, as large firms and the world starts to decarbonize and green their value chains, I think for the legacy firms that have the incumbents which are there, they're largely reliant on what I would call brown energy. So if Africa can really ramp up on renewable energy, there may be an opportunity to get manufacturing and value addition back in Africa. Thanks.
Thanks, Vivek. And Joanne, I mean, the NBI, your organization looks at the private sector on a whole. We know that wind is already playing a really big role in terms of foreign direct investment, and to the point where President Ramaphosa has commissioned this presidential climate commission with some big announcements this week around just transition. Do you think when the wind industry from a private sector perspective is really getting traction within government and in a position to grow?
Okay, so I think that in South Africa, there's a long way for the renewables industry to go. So if we look at wind at the moment, there's currently 2.5 gigawatts of wind that is currently installed in South Africa. There's currently a bid window 5 that has been opened up for renewables for solar and wind. And there's another 1.6 gigawatts that will come on stream as a result of that. And the country plan is it's about 17.7 gigawatts to be installed by 2030. But I think that from the perspective of the private sector, it isn't adequate and it doesn't realize the potential. So what we've been doing over the last year is that we've worked with a group of around 30 CEOs from large South African companies. And what we've tried to do is to develop net zero 2050 pathways for different sectors of the South African economy. And in the decarbonization pathway that business is putting forward, what we believe we need to do is to overbuild renewables essentially in a very massive way in South Africa. We believe that we're going to need 150 gigawatts of installed capacity, with a very vast majority of that being renewables by 2050. And the reason for that is twofold. The one is to be able to address the issues around just transition and the employment and job creation effects of having a very long and steady process of installing new capacity on the system. But the other side of that is in part about the localization and the potential then to create sustainable industries, but also because we want to create new industries. So if you look at the possibilities of green hydrogen in a country like South Africa, it demands a much bigger grid than one might imagine. So I think all of those factors and the fact that government has put in place a very ambitious NDC, I think is opening up a further window of opportunity in South Africa at the moment.
Thanks, Joanne. And I'd like to, I think the key thing here is that we have the technology. It's not a financing issue. The potential is there. We're just not seeing enough projects. And this is the key message from the wind industry that we're seeing all over the world. Now, as far as Africa is concerned, I mean, why aren't we seeing more bankable projects? I'd like to just throw that out as an open question, because you know what, everything else seems to be in place. John.
As said, the investment appetite is there, Emerson. What we consider is that, as Vivek was saying, we have to educate governments about how competitive wind is. I think they still think in the wind related to development funding, which is not anymore needed. And I think scaling solar and scaling wind are a good, let's say, very good programs to accelerate investment. I think that one of the many struggles that the private sector is facing, Emerson, is that there is no holistic approach view on the wind projects in Africa. I mean, African countries are looking into the domestic demand to develop which role should be playing wind in the domestic energy mix. And it may be because of they don't want to thinking into the current structure of signing PPAs. They don't want, and I fully understand that, they don't want to enter into a further PPAs, be an economic burden to the country, while they may be potentially already covering the base load through other energy sources, not renewables, but that is the current situation. We have seen many projects being on the table for signing a PPA, even from a parliamentary point of view, nearly getting the approval from the parliament, but struggling to get a PPA because, okay, the governments don't want to enter into further PPAs. I think one of the key elements that could trigger and unleash the full potential of African wind would be the power pools, whether it is connecting countries and looking into which, as said, if 59,000 gigas of wind power is potentially in more than 27 countries out of the 54 countries of Africa, they have enough wind resource. It could be good to look where is wind, create wind hubs, because investment, as said, money is not a problem, but scale is a problem. You cannot expect an investor, a private investor, to be investing in a 10 megawatt project isolatedly in a country, not only in Africa, anywhere in the world. Would it make sense is to build a 300, 500 megawatt project, because there you can gain from economies of scale, there is volume, there is all the multiplying effect of socioeconomic benefits, and even for the country. If the country itself is not demanding the 500 megawatt of installed capacity itself, it can get additional tax revenues by selling clean power to the neighboring countries and benefiting the whole region. So we consider that this scale, either from a domestic point of view or from a power pool point of view, would be the multiplying and the triggering elements to unleash the full potential of wind power in Africa.
So more bankable projects through regional power pools as a solution. Juliana, how are you seeing it? How else can we solve this lack of bankable projects issue?
I completely agree with what John has said. I think if we just look at even the East African power pool and how we could have actually assisted the South African power pool when South Africa was going through their load shedding, that's a very clear indication of an opportunity of how we can actually work together. And it would be great if we can also ensure that that conversation moves forward with governments and policymakers. So in terms of bankability of projects, and I agree this is a challenge from the development side, and ensuring that you have the right quality of projects to take it all the way to plug into the grid. So Kenya currently right now is going through a transition, and we're moving away from a mechanism that was great for attracting investment initially, and we want to adopt what is currently happening in South Africa, which is a competitive tender and auction system. And we believe that this move will remove the uncertainty and the delays that the previous mechanisms had, and actually increase the number of bankable projects that we can actually look at as investors. So from our side, from the Kenyan context, the current activities that are ongoing may seem disruptive in the short term, but in the long term, it's very good for the sector. It's very good for getting bankable projects on board.
Thanks, Juliana. And Vivek, we know that, you know, you alluded to a scaling wind program following the scaling solar. I know it's not officially announced yet. Could you give us a bit of a sneak peek? Because I know this is the exact issue that the IFC is trying to deal with on the continent.
Yeah, so thanks, Emerson. So let's just step back a bit. So IFC has financed almost 70 wind projects, about 4.5 gigawatts so far. And we think that the challenges are pretty common. So one is sort of lack of familiarity in the country on wind technology and wind potential. The second is the economic factors or the sector factors, which sometimes impede good quality PPAs, which are not very bankable. And third is environmental and social risks. So the way that we think we need to go about this is to use high resolution, near-scale wind models, which will tell you which are the sites. And that is critical because that's, I think, I would argue, 70% of the challenge. So once you have the sites in place, then if you have standardized documents and people know what to expect, and you don't negotiate a document every time you have a new site, you can really cut down the costs and the time taken. And that's what, and then the last thing that you really need is some sort of a confidence that governments will not backtrack on their commitments, that there's transparency, there's consistency and continuity, and contracts and concessions will be honored here. So once you have all this in place, you literally, companies can come, they can bid, we can, if you're comfortable, provide financing or a letter of intent. So companies know exactly, or have a fair idea of what the cost of financing will be. And that's how you start getting tariffs down. So it's going to be a combination of all these factors. That's what we did in scaling solar, which we're now taking beyond Africa. It's going to Central Europe now. So we think if we use a similar model, and I'm not saying identical because the sector factors could be different, we think we can achieve similar success with wind in Africa using this model.
That's great. So we've heard some different perspectives on, you know, how we solve this bankable project issue. You know, unlocking financing through a program like Scaling Wind, regional power pools, and the like. What about from a grassroots level? I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, South Africa has just announced the International Just Energy Transition Partnership. There is, you know, a simultaneous coal phase out going with a ramp up in renewable energy. How do we ensure that the energy transition and uptake of wind is, I guess, brings, you know, the civil society along, and the role it can play, Joanne?
Okay, so I think two things, and maybe just to respond to your previous question, I think the problem in South Africa is not about project development. I think we have that. It is about slow implementation from government and inconsistent implementation from government. And I think that it is a problem across the continent. It's partly about a capacity problem, but it's also about vested interest and the way that governments respond to different pressures at different points in time that has meant that you've got bankable and projects that are ready for implementation that have been stalled. So I think that kind of South Africa is maybe a bit ahead of a whole lot of other countries, but I think that if you don't get that policy and regulatory framework in place and a government that's 100% behind it, you sit with a very big problem for wind developers. I think that in South Africa, two things about participation. The one thing is that the renewables industry that has developed in the country is very largely led by foreign companies. And while that is good for FDI, it's not necessarily very good for a sense of ownership and empowerment by local partners. And so I think that part of what we're going to have to do in our context is to ensure that the kinds of partnerships and the development of local industries take place, and that the foreign wind and solar renewables companies that are coming into the country work in a much more systematic way and help to support and develop the development of a local industry. So it isn't seen as something that is coming in from outside where there isn't any kind of local ownership. That is the one side of it. I think the second is related to the value chain and the potential for local component manufacturing, and I think one's going to have to look very carefully about what it makes sense to manufacture locally and what the value chain opportunities are, and to ensure that those are delivered to locals. And then lastly, it's about skills and jobs. And I think those things are going to have to be developed in a much more systematic way than we have before. I mean, we have a terrible education system, and finding the right skills is very hard in South Africa. So systematic development of the human capital, and therefore through that, the creation of jobs, I think is the other thing. And I think that that's probably also a continental problem. Thanks.
Did you want, John?
Yeah,
go ahead.
I wanted, if I may, Emerson, I wanted to endorse what Johan was saying as regards to domestic investments. Vivek also mentioned, we try to educate. We have to educate governments about what wind sends, what the value added that we can bring. But I think having in Africa bulk amounts of private investments available, I think that African investors should be playing a more relevant role in getting and unlocking the full potential of wind power, because we still see that many foreign investors are the ones driving the energy transition in Africa, while there are private investors in Africa that are still investing in fossil fuels. So I think even, let's say, from the private investment sector for Africa could be the voice to be heard as regards to implementing the wind technology in Africa, in the continent.
No, thanks, John. And I think this is a really good point, because what we've seen, from our perspective as the Global Wind Energy Council, we've seen case studies and success stories about, sort of the global industry entering markets, but with a view to creating a local industry and renewables represent that long-term sustainable industry opportunity. We've seen it in Brazil, we've seen it in other places in Latin America, across Europe, and with long-term targets and stability. But we're still seeing a narrative from certain governments in Africa. I'm not sure if any of you have read it in the news, op-eds from the leaders of Uganda and Nigeria, recently putting out things ahead of COP by saying that, why is, renewables, why are renewables being forced upon us as an unreliable forms of energy, equating it to keeping, some countries in Africa in a state of poverty, whereas actually from the wind industry, we see it as a key to long-term, sustainable development. I mean, how do we counter this type of narrative in a positive way? Juliana, maybe you can comment on that first.
Yes, thanks, Emerson. I mean, you can kind of understand where African countries are coming from when it comes to these comments that are being put across. Most of the development that happened initially with African countries when it came to the energy mix, it was done off the back of non-renewable energy sources, or in this case, fossil fuels. And the upfront cost of starting to adopt renewable energy, maybe for the last few years, perhaps has been considered a bit expensive, with a lot of the manufacturing being outside, a lot of the skills being sourced from outside the countries. So all these culminates into perhaps them seeing the difficulty in actually adopting renewable energy sources. Having said that, however, in the Kenyan context, we have managed to achieve 80% energy access. We have 70% of our installed capacity as renewable energy, and 90% of dispatched energy is actually from renewable energy sources. So these discussions around lack of reliability with governments, you can understand it's probably from the intermittent nature of wind and solar. One is good at night, one is good during the day. How do they manage this? Again, I would like to go back to ensuring that whenever we're discussing renewable energy, and in this case, wind, we need to be very additive to the conversation. So it's not just wind we're talking about. How are we looking at the challenges that governments and policymakers are facing? How are we, as wind and renewable energy, trying to be the solution to those challenges? So if they're saying that it affects the grid, it's intermittent, it's not reliable, what solutions are we bringing to the table? Whether it's battery storage or hybrid, the hybrid nature of solar and wind, and even battery. and looking at the conversation in that sense. Like I said, it can't just be wind, it has to be something else. And let's not also forget that governments understand the solutions that are there. They have done a lot of training around this. They know storage can work. They know that hybrid works, but it's about us taking it to the next level and actually collaborating with them and ensuring that these solutions are actually implemented. So whether it's bringing investments to pilot some of these projects, whether it's having those, like we're doing with WEC, the technical seminars, and having decision makers in the room, also part of that conversation, to make sure that this narrative is switched, it's spun around, and wind is considered as a solution to those challenges.
Any other panelists like to comment on that one? Vivek?
So I think just a couple of points. So coming back to your point, I think the challenge we have, there are enough technical solutions for a just transition, or what I'd like to call a fair transition, but it's the political economy that people are not looking at. So you can say, and you can raise capital, there is capital out there for this, but it's really important that you look at what is the political economy and the vested interests, which are, I think, going to be hampering this transition. And to counter that, you really need to come up with a comprehensive solution that you will reskill workers who will get laid off, that you will compensate owners of coal mines. You cannot just ignore them. Otherwise, what I fear is we'll hopefully tackle the climate problem, but we'll have an unemployment problem eventually. So that's one. Second is, coming back to what you said, is, I can understand if 15 years ago somebody said that renewable energy is not viable or it's expensive. When we started financing wind and solar, it was between 26 to 28 cents. So there's a huge level of subsidy there. But today in India, it's come down to less than 2 cents. Even in Zambia, we did it at less than 5 cents. So I think there is enough evidence that well-structured projects with a fair risk reward, you're going to come down, the tariffs are going to come low. Then comes to intermittency. I think there are enough studies, even with wind. You can, with some amount of confidence, predict what the wind factor is going to be. And then I've come up with this slogan while I was sitting here, is that, what stops us in Africa, I'm told that wind, your best time is early mornings and evenings. So that would really complement solar. So what stops us from having a 100 megawatt wind farm, 100 megawatt solar farm? Obviously, you need grid connectivity. You need to work that out. So it's, again, the whole area of intermittency. And I think that factor will come down as storage technologies and the price of storage comes down. So I would just say it's not wind or solar. I think the dream team is wind and solar. And if you combine that with storage technologies or storage capacity, I just see no reason why it can't happen. And it's really the political will. It's really being able to demonstrate that this works. And this has been demonstrated by us, by all of you all. So it's really a matter of political will to move on with it now.
John, if you have any comment on that, but also, South Africa, although is not a perfect case, is a case study that is important for the rest of the continent in terms of the role that wind has played. We're here telling good stories and trying to counter narratives. Just want to know if you could bring a little bit of insight into the South African experience for us.
Okay, so I'm sure that many people here know that South Africa is struggling with an old and largely coal grid that is really, really struggling, and that at the moment we are subject to what's called load shedding. So in order to ensure that the grid can continue to function, every kind of 2 or 3 times a day, there are countrywide outages in different areas for 2.5 hours. In that process, the current renewables capacity that has been installed has been absolutely critical in keeping the grid going and in providing a buffer that has ensured that probably there is another at least 5,000 to 8,000 megawatts of load that is being supplied from elsewhere into the grid. So I think that, and without it, I think the country would be in a much worse situation than we are at the moment. So our utility understands that. I think there's a lot of ignorance in our country, and I'm sure right across the continent in relation to the capacity of renewables, the relationship of renewables to base load, how wind and solar can work together, how you can use, and how a diverse energy mix needs to come together. I think the other issue that is really important in our country is the issue of having the right kind of transmission grid. And a key issue for South Africa, if we do go for a much larger renewables rollout in relation to both solar and wind, as well as investing in things like battery storage over the next period, is going to be to do a very significant degree of grid strengthening, because a big barrier that we're facing at the moment is the ability to connect into the grid in the right places. So I think one has to take a kind of system-wide approach and look at where everything fits in, but also have a long-term plan. And I think this idea of a 30-year plan that takes us to 2050 is critical, because then you can have very clear milestones in terms of what one wants to achieve along that road.
Thanks, Joanne. I'd like to move to some Q&A here. I do have a question online, but I'd like to give our in-person audience the chance first. Any questions? All right, we'll start with you right in the front. Could you please state your name and allegiance?
I'm Richard Longington and work for Consultancy. So my question is, so having once lived in Africa for a short time, I noticed that sort of Africa, the country where I was, suffered from frequent power cuts due to lack of reliable and dispatchable source of electricity. Wind, in its nature, is unreliable. Currently, wind would be more part of the problem and the solution to power cuts. Should the wind industry not wait for sufficient dispatchable power to be installed for constructing wind farms?
So to recap, the question is about power cuts in Africa and whether intermittent, we say, not unreliable, such as wind, forms of wind, of renewable energy, such as wind, would essentially exacerbate that problem. I'd like to start with John here to my right, unless anyone else wants to raise their hand.
Well, thank you very much for your question. I mean, I think that wind is the solution, is not the problem. First of all, you have to take into account what the climate emergency we are living. So we need clean power to be generated. Second, I think Vivek has already underlined, if mainstream generation technologies currently all around the world are renewables, and wind, I think even under the pandemic, last year was a record year, nearly 100 gigas were installed globally. It is not because wind is unreliable. It is because wind is reliable. It provides energy security. Think about so many countries that they have to import energy from the outside to meet the energy demands. That is provoking geopolitical instability and also price volatility. If you are unlocking the full potential domestically that you may have, you have stability in your region and you may know what you can generate. There are already, I think Vivek has already underlined, this is not only about wind, this is about combining the perfect energy mix from a generation point of view, from a consumption point of view, and also from a competitiveness point of view. So wind, solar, storage. And storage is not a science fiction book, not a film. Storage is already there. We at Siemens Gamesa, we have already built hybrid projects with diesel, solar PV, wind, and batteries. Consider also that you have in Africa hydro vast sources, and hydro pumps currently are the most used storage systems for new non-conventional renewables such as wind and solar. So in order to give a second thought to the way you were provoking the question, I don't think unreliable, I mean, wind is unreliable. It is unreliable. There are already also digitalization related systems controlling demand so that you may couple generation with demand. So I don't think, as said, even related to the argument about wind being expensive, wind is not anymore expensive. Wind is not anymore unreliable. So I think we should be eradicating such arguments when lobbying, and even more that we are in COP26, when lobbying and advocating in favor of renewable sources.
Anyone else, please?
So just very quickly, I hear what you're saying, and it depends how you define reliable or unreliable. But I don't think, much as my friends at GWEC would like me to propagate, I don't think wind is the only solution. I think what we're saying is that you have to look at an energy mix which makes sense. And wind is one part of that puzzle. Now, if you were to wait, and as they say, what's the term? Perfection is the enemy of the good. If you were to wait for that perfection to happen, you would invest in fossil fuels today, which has a shelf life of between 30 to 40 years. So you're going to be either having stranded assets, or you're going to be locked in for the next 30 to 40 years. So I think what we all need to move towards is an energy mix that makes sense country by country or regional pools. And wind, we think, is going to be an important part of that energy mix.
John.
Yeah, so in my country, the unreliability comes from coal. Our aging and disintegrating coal fleet is largely incapable anymore of powering the grid in a consistent and reliable way. And the inability to attract funding, the fact that the coal majors in my country are looking to a long-term phase out of coal means that there's no point in trying to, in fact, reconstruct or build a new coal plant. Nuclear is at this point in time far too expensive for our country to entertain. So our coal utility, Eskom, is looking by the mid-2030s to retire 22 gigawatts of coal and to bring in a mixture of increased renewables, battery storage, and other technologies in order to be able to drive it. And all of our big industry, our energy-intensive industries, so the mines, the refineries, a whole range of energy-intensive industries at the moment are looking to, in particular, solar to power their plant. So I think that in South Africa, necessity has pushed us very rapidly in the direction of some very significant investment in a renewable dominant energy mix, but not only a renewable energy mix.
I mean, just one quick comment. I think it's about taking a system-wide point of view. It's about having a flexible grid and not just turning on the on and off switch yet. And that requires, matching generation profiles, and you can actually get that sort of firm power by matching that with demand. But happy to take that question offline with some of the panelists later. Thank you for that. That was a good one. Please, in the back, I think, James, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. So my name is James. It is a different kind of proceedings. People at all of climate models, most of the continents dry. This is continent is the same, which is also we've seen what it past 10 years when it's right and line. At the same time, this is also the region that is massive and exploited potential in terms of fossil fuels. In the proposal which is being made, that could actually mitigate win-win solutions, particularly natural gas. Seasonal fuel to produce several streams of energy. Of course, generating sufficient resources to invest in other cleaner renewables. While generating very in terms of additional emissions. I think you could get less than 6% of the next Africa's total emissions. So I think perhaps the way to structure our organization should not be sort of by imposing a quota between fossil fuels and renewables on Africa. That the quota can possibly be relevant else for historical reasons. But for Africa, we have to address also historical just transition question, and there should be also space to consider and to create conditions how I call this, this will fuel the total transition.
So James from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, talking about the effects of climate change on the significant hydro capacity across the continent. And as a brief recap, I think the idea was that should we be investing in gas as a transition fuel and use those revenues to fuel the transition to renewables on a longer term, I guess, versus advocating doing that right away and one or the other. Vivek, I know you have to go. Thank you very much for having us. He's got another panel right away. He's a very popular man, but hopefully we can pass it over to maybe Juliana, if you'd like to come in on that one first.
I'm not too sure I got the question, and correct me if I'm wrong. So the question is, can use gas to replace the current, let's say, other fossil fuels to help us now transition into greater percentage of renewable energy sources. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I guess with hydro capacity declining, should we be using gas as a to slow and smooth the transition to renewables versus going straight to wind and solar?
Okay, so perhaps maybe I can give an example of the context of Kenya. And for us, like I mentioned, we have 70% renewable energy installed capacity. And a lot of this is actually hydro and geothermal, and these act as our base load. But we do also have the non-renewable energy fossil fuels. But it's not lost on us that we need to go cleaner. So there is definitely a plan to transition into sort of natural gas with those units as we phase them out and try and build up on geothermal. Geothermal is great for us. It's renewable, it's base load, but it's also very complex and takes a bit longer. So like we said, we want to ensure that we balance and the decisions we make around the energy mix make sense, and we don't end up in a situation where supply is not able to meet demand. I think that's the example I can give, and it will also allow for us to put in a lot more renewables onto the grid in the medium and long term.
So I think that the IEA 1.5 degrees report talks about gas as a proxy bridging fuel for developing countries. And in the work that we've done as business in South Africa, we see that gas, particularly from now until probably the end of the 2030s, would be really important as a bridging solution in relation to supporting peaking and intermittency as we both develop our capacity and develop the strength of the grid. What I think the debate is in what form do you use that gas? That's what I think the really important issue is, because you don't want to end up as you move towards 2050 with stranded gas assets. And so I think that the solution that we've come up with, or our preferred option, would be certainly in the South African or Southern African power pool case to look at LNG, liquefied natural gas, as the best way that one could deliver gas into the grid, but not ensure that you have a lock-in and avoid the risk of stranded assets. So yes, we think that gas is probably going to be in the short run something that is necessary for us, but in the short run.
As a way of balancing the grid, essentially.
As a balance,
yeah,
peaking
exactly.
To manage peaking and intermittency.
Yeah. Max, we'll get to you first. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Gordon from Zimbabwe. It's a very interesting presentation we're having here. But I would like to go back to some of the basic issues in terms of how different countries are at different levels in terms of access. Whilst we're talking about the transition, some of our countries are still to get funding to have clear resource assessment in terms of things like wind. We do not have long-term studies which show the level of wind which we have in our country. As part will need to have funding to do that. So that as we transition, once we understand the issues of technologies and how they will come in and the need for storage, like he said, we are in a continent which is also very affected by climate change, where the southern part of Africa is becoming dry, and our main state in terms of the hydro is much less than what we can. But for us, we believe transition is possible because we can use our hydro as storage so that we can then manage it and dispatch it together with solar and wind if we can get significant resources. So the issue is funding. The transition has to be funded somehow. And also the issue of access to funding for project development and getting the projects to that bankability level is quite critical. We have a challenge with access. We can move from, we have owned assets like South Africa in terms of our technology assets, but we still believe because of the energy needs we have for security purposes, we still need to retain a certain level of fossil fuel until we then get to the level where we can. And for us, that's the critical area. But my main question is the issue of funding for projects, right from project operation up to the issue of funding. How are you placed in making sure I see the answers to the plan, but they do the
That's right. Thank you very much. Question from Zimbabwe's Secretary of Energy. Thank you very much for joining us. Really about how to fund the transition. It sounds like the political will is there. That's a key thing. So thank you very much for that intervention. Over to the panel in terms of how, I mean, Joanne, maybe one for you. I mean, how do you fund the transition? There's a big announcement from South Africa this week. I know, so related or not, but
okay. So I reckon that behind the question is the elephant in the room in this COP, which is around climate finance and the obligations of the developed world to support the developing world to decarbonize. And I mean, I'm not certain where the finance negotiation is going to end up in this COP. I'm not terribly optimistic, but I think that one of the things is that there is for me, what we are dealing with is a situation where public finance needs to leverage private finance. And I think there the issues of project development and good project development become really important, as well as obviously ensuring that where the public finance exists, that it is mobilized and structured in a way that can actually support increased private sector investment. So I think that we are in a world of public-private partnerships in our country. This 8.5 billion kind of offer that we have received from a consortium of developed countries is going to be able to get us off first base, but it's certainly not going to be able to do the job. What is required is going to be a figure that is much, much higher than that. But I think the hope is that the offer of that $8.5 billion will allow us to then crowd in a wide range of other financiers who will that there will be an element of concessionality that will allow us to develop a blended finance deal. I think importantly, in relation to the just transition itself, it is really important that in that there is some level of grant finance. So when we look at the issue of reskilling workers in the coal value chain, when we look at the issue of social protection for people who might lose their jobs, for communities that would otherwise be decimated by the fact that the areas where they live, that economic activity is going to be removed. I think that the issue of ensuring that there is some level of grant in order to be able to support people through the transition for us is an absolutely critical issue.
I was going to say that, I mean, it is rather a very good question. This is the reason for example, why Secretary IFC conducted together with GWEC a most recent potential wind resource assessment regarding Africa, adapted to the new technologies, because the last one was many, many years ago, and it was not adapted to the new technologies, new capacity factors, and so on and so forth. I think that money, Vivek was saying from IFC, money is not the problem. There is, the private sector is willing to invest in wind resource assessments, capacity building. I would say that the main challenge is let's say the political frameworks in order to enable the long-term investments, either private money or, as Johan was saying, public related to development funding, leveraging private money to be invested in the transition, in providing you with assessments, with installing metmasts and having the metmasts for 1 year, 2 years, to try to verify which is the real wind resource from Zimbabwe, and then enable the appropriate frameworks to private investments to go in. That is doable. I mean, wind has never been as competitive as it is today. So we have all the elements to do so. So I mean, and this is GWEC Africa Task Force engaging with Zimbabwean government. I think it could be a good capacity building opportunity to bring on board all the relevant stakeholders along the value chain to make the wind story happen in the country.
Thanks, John. Juliana, any words for the Energy Secretary of Zimbabwe here on financing the transition?
Yeah, just to underscore what Joanna said in regards to PPP, public-private partnerships, and this is something that we've seen working very well in Kenya, and it's something that will imminently also start on the geothermal side, because it's complex, it's costly, it's a good place to start and see where both public and private sector can work together. So I'm a big advocate of PPP and having a good framework and regulatory framework around that, and seeing how we can actually use that to broaden the transition of renewable energy sources. The other thing is around development and the challenges around there. So how are we helping local developers actually get to what we call in this sense a sort of bankable project? How can we get financing around there? So I don't know, sorry for this, but I'll always go back to the geothermal case, which we also still have some public participation where government actually does the surface studies, explores, and actually does some form of exploration, deep exploration, sorry, and then they are able to auction off the concessions or even sell the steam. So that type of participation is very necessary. And I think it's something that will work. The other thing is we've seen a bit more activity on the Kenyan side when it comes to pension funds wanting to actively participate in projects. I think South Africa has done a very good job of including the local capital markets into the energy transition, and I think we're seeing a lot more of that happening. But we need to do a lot more when it comes to strengthening the capital in order for them to fully participate in the energy transition and in these huge renewable energy projects. So we're just getting started. There's some good examples already, and something that countries can adopt very easily.
Thank you, Juliana. Ms. Secretary, we'd be happy to continue the conversation with you after this. Connect you with the IFC and the Scaling Wind program. The timing is good, as well as some of the latest wind measurement data from your country. So thank you for your question. Max, you're well known to the Wind Pavilion. Can you please state your name and allegiance and your question, please?
No, thank you. I'll just make two short questions.
Yeah.
Actually, the first one was to South Africa. I think we're celebrating the 8.5 billion, and I think that's a good thing, and we'd like to learn the lessons as you mentioned. My question was, is there a sense of how much the transition will cost? Because the 8.5 billion is just a start. The question of maybe I missed it, maybe it was already discussed when I was out, but the sense of that. And second, Secretary, I've listened to the discussions that Zimbabwe said, I think Zimbabwe is making a compelling case. I'm a little disappointed. It's not resonating as much as it should. What do you mean when you say political framework? So we better understand what we need to do. And finally, the James, I think, is raising a very good point around perhaps gas being a transitional fuel. I wonder whether that the choice of that is ultimately an economic one, depending on what is the ultimate choice that you're going to use. For South Africa, it makes sense because you've chosen hydrogen in the end, and you are making a determination that in 20, 30 years, the cost of hydrogen will probably be around $2 per whatever it is that you're looking. So it makes sense to use gas, but if it's wind, why don't you just go into wind?
As an economic choice.
Yeah.
Okay. To recap, we have Max Moreira from the Rwanda/Zimbabwe delegation, reinforcing the case that Zimbabwe is making strides, but that the business case for renewable energy or just generally sustainable development is not being made well enough. We can help you with that. And the question to Joanne was, how much will the full energy transition cost in South Africa? And the follow-up question is, if gas is being treated as a transitional technology, is that an economic choice, or is it purely based on economics? And John, you can please comment afterwards on what you mean by political frameworks. That would be good to clarify what that means. It's very important. I think I got all that.
Okay, so I think it's important to say that our country doesn't yet have a 2050 plan. Our NTC does take the country, it does put us on a 1.5 degree path at the bottom of the range. The range is between 350 at the bottom and 420 at the top. So that's the range that we look at South Africa. To get to 350 would require some very fundamental changes to our energy economy. What we do have is a piece of work that the business community in South Africa has done, the NBI, together with Business Unity South Africa, and led by a grouping of 30 CEOs. And that piece of work envisages an energy mix of around 150 gigawatts of renewables by 2050. It envisages gas in the from now up until probably the end of the 2030s as a transition fuel for peaking and intermittency. It looks at us starting to build a green hydrogen economy starting now. And it looks at quite significant investment in battery storage, also in embedded generation, and a range of other measures, and also probably looks towards a set of technologies that are in development at the moment, but that will hopefully, as we move through the next 30 years, become commercialized, such as direct air capture. Our assessment is that we are looking, that is going to cost trillions of rands. We're not looking, it isn't cheap. It's not a small amount of money, but clearly the economics and the finances around that, there's still quite a lot of work to be done. But if you look at the 8.5 billion, as I said, it gets us on a path. It's certainly in no way going to get us significantly far along it. I think that given the fact that South Africa is treated as a middle income developing country, that a large degree of this finance is going to be mobilized from some level of grant and concessional finance, but it's going to have to be heavily leveraged by private, domestic, and foreign capital.
I don't know if Juliana wants to add anything to the discussion on, I mean, answering to your.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Juliana. Answering your question with political, rather than political frameworks, I was meaning policy frameworks, in the sense of, if you are going to I said, money is not the problem, either because of the public money or the private money. Even in the, as Juliana was saying, the pension funds also being involved in the development renewables. It is how you will be structuring the energy sector. You have to provide private investors about what your demand, what the expected demand is, what the energy mix you are willing, what your wind resources there is where we can assess, what is the policy scheme that you want to implement in the future for private investors to go in. For example, at the very beginning, are you willing for the Zimbabwean public utility to be investing into the first renewable projects to enable then right after the private sector to let in? Or, for example, you may be benefiting from similar scaling wind program where everything is already packed and private investors should be auctioning and bidding for that for those new capacity. This is what is going to be attracting the private investors and accelerating. It is not the lack of wind resource, which is not the problem. There is wind. There is appetite, investment appetite. You need to provide investors about certainty. This is not about just building 150, 100 megawatt project. It is what is your willingness for wind to be bringing to your energy mix, and which is the horizon, for example, from now until 2030 of wind capacity to be built in the country. That is what I meant, and sorry for that misunderstanding about the political or policy framework to give investors with certainty. Maybe Juliana, I mean, you being from the investor side, maybe you would like to eye blink on my words on that.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with what you said, and maybe I can share a lesson learned. So like I mentioned, we're sort of transitioning into a new procurement structure. We initially had a feed-in tariff system that was going to attract investors through unsolicited proposal, and we got a lot of interest. We have constructed and implemented, I'd say, 5 to 6 projects, solar and wind. It did its job. It's something that happened 10 years ago, but there are a lot of lessons that were learned there. One thing I would advise the Zimbabwean and Rwandan delegates is to ensure that you're consulting and collaborating with private sector when you're looking at these policies. You want to ensure that there's going to be an equitable outcome for the investors and the public sector, and also more importantly, the general public who are the sole beneficiaries of this product that we're producing. So we are hoping now that we're transitioning into this auction system and new procurement structure, we are actively and with a lot of intention engaging with public sector, collaborating with them, letting them know what would work, what wouldn't. Remember, private sector is also not only participating in your market. There are some who are global players, there are some who want in other markets. They know exactly what makes sense from a private sector standpoint to maintain and retain investment in the country. So just a word from our side as investors, it's important to also have a sense of collaboration, engagement, and transparency when coming up with these policies.
Thanks, Juliana. Due to an engaged audience and some really great questions, we've gone way over time already, but I would encourage you all to grab a coffee and continue the conversation just outside here at the Wind Pavilion. If it's okay with everyone, I'm going to provide some closing remarks and a bit of a recap. And I'll start with just an observation that we've had as here at the Wind Pavilion, being a private sector delegation representing the global wind industry. Just upstairs from where we are right now, we have a private meeting room, and we've met with delegations representing many countries across Africa. And a clear message now is that NDCs are becoming a real policy driver and actually serving to streamline and I guess align. We're seeing ministries of economy, of environment, and of energy. And the idea being is that, with renewable energy targets, with NDCs, with net zero targets, or just, sustainable development goals, wind and solar are key pillars to this. And we've spoken about technologies that will help allow those things to be key pillars, whether that's gas peaking or whether it's hydro. But, back to the IEA assumes that it's 70% of the global energy mix is going to be wind and solar by 2050. So the investment needs to start now, and we need that long-term policy, stability, regulatory frameworks that are no longer fit for purpose and designed around aging coal fleets, and more flexible grids and simultaneous investment in transmission systems that are going to allow us to capture the potential of renewable energy. And we know that wind potential in Africa can power the planet, many times over. It's just about capturing a small amount of that in the next little while and starting right now. So I want to thank you all very much and remind you that GWEC has just launched its Africa Wind Power Initiative with our team in Nairobi, and we're looking to engage with many more governments here at COP and beyond. So thank you so much for joining and attending the virtual session, attending virtually, and to our panelists, Juliana in Nairobi, representing the Electricity Sector Association of Kenya, our local partner there, John from Siemens Gamesa, Joanne from NBI and the South African delegation, and Vivek from the IFC, who had to leave a bit early. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoy your day.